They called him the Moses of Kentucky. But what the history books won't tell you is that Elijah Anderson wasn't just a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was a black man born into slavery who somehow orchestrated one of the most sophisticated escape networks in American history, moving over 1,000 enslaved people to freedom before his mysterious death in a Kentucky prison in 1857. The official records state he died of natural causes at age 47, but 3 guards who witnessed his final hours refused to speak about what they saw, and the prison warden ordered Anderson's body buried in an unmarked grave within 6 hours of his death, with no autopsy, no family notification, and no public record of the burial location. For over a century and a half, Anderson's story has been deliberately obscured, his methods kept secret, and the true circumstances of his final days hidden behind layers of destroyed documents and sealed testimonies. What you're about to hear is the result of years of research into fragmented court records, private letters, and testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day. A story of courage, deception, and a network so intricate that even today, historians cannot fully explain how one man accomplished what entire abolitionist organizations struggled to achieve. Before we continue with the story of Elijah Anderson, if you're fascinated by untold American histories and dark mysteries from our past, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And I'd love to know. Leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now let's uncover the truth about the man they tried to erase from history. The story of Elijah Anderson begins not with his heroism, but with a mystery that surrounds even his birth. A mystery that would define everything that came after. Madison, Indiana, in the 1830s was a river town caught between 2 worlds. Situated on the Ohio River's northern bank, it served as a crucial port where Kentucky tobacco and hemp crossed into free territory, where southern plantation owners conducted business with northern merchants, and where the invisible line between slavery and freedom was as real as the muddy water that separated the states. The town's population of nearly 3,000 souls included German immigrants who'd fled European upheaval, Irish laborers who worked the docks, Quaker families whose quiet abolitionism simmered beneath polite society, and a small but growing community of free black residents who lived under the constant shadow of kidnapping and re-enslavement. The Anderson family had arrived in Madison around 1835, though the circumstances of their arrival remained deliberately vague in the sparse records that mentioned them. Elijah Anderson appeared in the 1836 city directory as a free man of color, working as a stonecutter, a skilled trade that suggested education and training uncommon for someone of his background. He lived in a modest frame house on West 2nd Street, in a neighborhood where free black families clustered together for mutual protection. His wife, whose name appears in records only as Sarah A., ran a small laundry business from their home, serving both white and black customers. What made Elijah Anderson unusual wasn't just his freedom or his skilled trade. It was the quiet authority he seemed to command among Madison's black community. Men and women sought his counsel on matters ranging from work disputes to family troubles. He could read and write with a fluency that surprised even educated whites who encountered him. And he possessed something else, something harder to define. An ability to move between worlds, to speak the language of rivermen and merchants, to understand the complex web of laws and customs that governed both free and enslaved black lives in a border state. But there was something about Anderson's past that he never discussed, a shadow that followed him despite his free papers. Those who knew him best noticed how he never spoke of his childhood, how he deflected questions about where he'd learned his trade, how his eyes would harden whenever conversation turned to the slave markets across the river in Kentucky. Some whispered that his free papers were forgeries, that he was a runaway who'd somehow obtained documentation. Others claimed he'd been freed by a guilty master's deathbed will. A few suggested something darker, that he'd purchased his freedom with money earned through means he'd rather not disclose. The truth, as it would eventually emerge through fragments of testimony and coded letters, was more complex than any of the rumors suggested. In the spring of 1839, a series of events began that would transform Elijah Anderson from a skilled tradesman into something far more dangerous, a man who would challenge the entire institution of slavery through methods so effective that slave owners across Kentucky would eventually offer a combined reward of $1,500 for his capture, dead or alive. It started with a knock on Anderson's door on a moonless night in April 1839. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and a cold rain fell steadily, turning Madison's unpaved streets into rivers of mud. Sarah answered the door to find a young black woman, no more than 17, soaked through and shivering violently. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and bleeding, and her eyes held a terror that needed no explanation. "Please," the girl whispered, glancing over her shoulder at the dark street. "Mr. Anderson." They said Mr. Anderson could help. Elijah appeared behind his wife, took one look at the girl and pulled her inside without a word. He moved with practiced efficiency, as if he'd done this before, though no one in Madison had ever seen evidence of such activity. Sarah brought blankets and hot coffee, while Elijah examined the girl's feet, which were cut deep from running through forest undergrowth. She'd crossed the river somehow, swimming in the dark, and made her way to Madison following directions she'd memorized, directions that had somehow included Elijah Anderson's name and address. The girl's name was Hannah, and she'd escaped from a tobacco plantation 15 miles south of Louisville. Her master had recently died, and his son had decided to sell off the estate's slaves to settle debts. Hannah had overheard herself being described to a slave trader from New Orleans, a man known for supplying the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana. She'd been given a choice between a living death in the Deep South or taking her chances in the river. What Hannah told the Andersons that night would have been unremarkable, another escape story among thousands, except for one detail that changed everything. She'd been given Anderson's name and address by another enslaved man on her plantation, a man who'd never left Kentucky, who'd never been to Madison, yet who somehow knew exactly where Elijah Anderson lived and what he could do. "He said you'd know how to get me to Canada," Hannah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said you'd done it for others. He said you were the Moses of Kentucky, that you could lead people out of bondage." Elijah's face revealed nothing, but Sarah's sharp intake of breath suggested this wasn't the first time they'd heard such things. For a long moment, Anderson simply stared at the girl, as if calculating risks and possibilities. Then he stood, walked to a small desk in the corner of the room, and pulled out a sheet of paper and a pencil. "Tell me everything you remember about the plantation," he said. "Every building, every road, every person who might have helped you. And tell me exactly what this man said to you, word for word." What emerged over the next 2 hours was evidence of something that shouldn't have existed. A communication network among enslaved people across Kentucky. A system for passing information about escape routes and safe houses. A web of connections that operated invisibly beneath the surface of plantation life. Hannah described how messages moved through a chain of trusted individuals, a field hand who delivered supplies to neighboring plantations, a blacksmith who traveled to repair tools, a preacher who held services for enslaved congregations, a laundress who collected and delivered clothing. Each person in the chain knew only the next link, never the full network, and each used coded language that sounded innocent to white ears, but carried specific meanings to those who understood. And at the center of this network, coordinating movements and providing resources, was Elijah Anderson, a man who was supposed to be simply a stonecutter in a river town. The next morning, Hannah was gone. Neighbors who might have noticed anything unusual saw only Elijah Anderson leaving for work at dawn, carrying his tools as always. But 3 days later, a notice appeared in the Louisville Daily Journal. A reward of $100 for the return of an escaped slave girl named Hannah, last seen near the Ohio River. The notice included a warning that anyone caught harboring or assisting the fugitive would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That same week, a letter arrived at the office of Madison's mayor from a prominent Kentucky plantation owner named Thornton Gaines. The letter, written in the formal language of legal threat, demanded that Madison's authorities investigate certain free-colored residents suspected of enticing slaves to escape. Though no names were mentioned, everyone understood who Gaines meant. The letter concluded with a barely veiled warning. If Madison continued to harbor those who interfered with property rights, Kentucky interests would take matters into their own hands. The letter was filed away and, officially, nothing was done. But in the careful balance of a border town that depended on trade with both North and South, the warning was heard. Elijah Anderson had been noticed, and once noticed, he would never again operate in complete shadow. What no one in Madison knew, what wouldn't be discovered until years later when court testimonies were finally unsealed, was that Hannah wasn't the first person Anderson had helped, or the 10th, or even the 100th. By the spring of 1839, Elijah Anderson had already been operating his network for nearly 4 years, moving enslaved people from Kentucky plantations to freedom in Canada, with a success rate that defied explanation. He'd developed methods that seemed impossible, forged free papers that could pass inspection, disguises that transformed field hands into traveling merchants, routes that avoided known slave catchers, and a network of safe houses that stretched from the Kentucky interior all the way to Detroit. But how had he built such a network? How did a stonecutter in Madison, Indiana, develop the resources, connections, and knowledge to orchestrate escapes across hundreds of miles? And perhaps most mysteriously, how did enslaved people in Kentucky, people who couldn't read, who'd never traveled beyond their plantations, who lived under constant surveillance, learn about Elijah Anderson and how to reach him? The answers to these questions lay buried in Anderson's past, in the years before he appeared in Madison, in a history he'd worked carefully to conceal. And as his network grew larger and more successful, as more enslaved people disappeared from Kentucky plantations, as rewards for his capture climbed higher, the pressure to uncover his secrets intensified. The investigation into Elijah Anderson's activities began quietly in the fall of 1839, initiated not by law enforcement, but by a private organization that few people knew existed. The Kentucky Association for the Protection of Property Rights had been formed 2 years earlier by a coalition of wealthy plantation owners who'd grown frustrated with the ineffectiveness of local authorities in stopping slave escapes. The association operated with substantial funds, employing private investigators, offering rewards, and maintaining a network of informants throughout the border states. Their interest in Anderson was sparked by a pattern that their meticulous record-keeping had revealed. Over the previous 3 years, 47 enslaved people had disappeared from plantations in a specific region of north-central Kentucky, a cluster of counties including Jefferson, Shelby, Franklin, and Woodford. This wasn't unusual in itself. Escapes happened regularly along the border. What was unusual was that none of these 47 people had been recaptured. Not one. In an era when most escaped slaves were caught within days, when professional slave catchers operated with brutal efficiency, when rewards and punishments kept most enslaved people from even attempting escape, a 100% success rate was statistically impossible. The association hired a man named Marcus Webb to investigate. Webb was a former Pinkerton agent who'd made a reputation tracking down bank robbers and counterfeiters. He approached the slave escape problem with the same methodical analysis he'd used in criminal investigations, collecting data, identifying patterns and following evidence wherever it led. Webb's investigation file, which would later be entered as evidence in Anderson's trial, revealed the depth of his findings. He'd interviewed plantation owners, questioned captured runaways from other networks, examined forged free papers, and traced the movements of known abolitionists. What emerged was a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Anderson's network, Webb discovered, operated on multiple levels. The first level consisted of stations, safe houses where fugitives could hide for a few hours or days. These weren't the homes of known abolitionists, which were watched by authorities, but rather the residences of people who seemed to have no connection to anti-slavery activities. A German immigrant farmer who spoke little English, a widow who ran a boarding house, a merchant who traded in agricultural supplies. Webb identified at least 15 such stations between central Kentucky and the Canadian border, but he suspected there were many more he couldn't find. The second level was communication. Webb documented how information moved through the network using methods that left no written evidence. Messages were embedded in songs sung by enslaved people during work, in patterns of laundry hung out to dry, in the arrangement of stones along certain roads, in coded phrases used during church services. A hymn about crossing the River Jordan meant someone was planning an escape. A particular pattern of quilts on a clothesline indicated whether a safe house was currently secure. A stone cairn with an odd number of rocks marked a trail to follow. The third level, and the most crucial, was documentation. Every escaped slave needed free papers to travel safely through free states, where black people were required to prove their status. Anderson had somehow obtained access to authentic free paper forms, possibly stolen from county clerks' offices, and had learned to forge the signatures and seals that made them legitimate. Webb had examined several sets of papers carried by captured fugitives, and even he, with his experience in detecting forgeries, had to admit they were nearly perfect. But the fourth level was what truly baffled Webb: the financial resources. Moving people hundreds of miles required money for food, clothing, transportation, bribes. Webb estimated that Anderson's network must be spending at least $2,000 per year, an enormous sum for a stonecutter who earned perhaps $300 annually. Where was the money coming from? Webb's investigation led him to a surprising discovery. Elijah Anderson wasn't just helping slaves escape, he was running what amounted to a business. Wealthy, free black families in the North, along with some white abolitionists, were paying Anderson to rescue specific individuals, family members who'd been sold south, spouses separated by sale, children torn from parents. Anderson charged fees based on the difficulty of the rescue, with prices ranging from $50 to $500. He used this money to fund escapes for those who couldn't pay, creating a system where the wealthy subsidized the poor. This revelation transformed how authorities viewed Anderson. He wasn't just an idealistic abolitionist helping the occasional fugitive. He was operating a sophisticated, profit-generating enterprise that threatened the entire economic foundation of slavery. If enslaved people knew they could be rescued for a price, if free black families could purchase escapes rather than accept permanent separation, if the system of slavery could be undermined through organized resistance rather than individual acts of desperation, then the institution itself was at risk. In December 1840, Marcus Webb submitted his final report to the Kentucky Association for the Protection of Property Rights. The report concluded with a recommendation. Elijah Anderson must be captured and prosecuted not just for helping fugitive slaves, but for conspiracy to deprive citizens of their property, for forgery, for operating a criminal enterprise across state lines. The association agreed and authorized Webb to coordinate with Kentucky law enforcement to build a legal case that could result in Anderson's arrest and conviction. But there was a problem. Anderson lived in Indiana, a free state where helping fugitive slaves wasn't a crime under state law. Federal fugitive slave laws existed, but they were difficult to enforce and required proof that Anderson had physically entered Kentucky to entice slaves to escape. Without such proof, Indiana authorities wouldn't cooperate with an arrest warrant. Webb needed evidence that Anderson had crossed into Kentucky, that he'd made direct contact with enslaved people, that he'd actively encouraged and facilitated escapes rather than simply helping those who arrived at his door. And to get that evidence, Webb would need to do something risky. He'd need to infiltrate Anderson's network. The plan Webb devised was simple, but dangerous. He would pose as a plantation owner's agent, seeking to hire Anderson to rescue a specific enslaved woman, Webb's own supposed wife, who'd been sold south after their owner's death. Webb would offer to pay Anderson's fee, follow him into Kentucky if possible, and document his methods. If Anderson took the bait, Webb would have the evidence needed for prosecution. In February 1841, Marcus Webb, posing as a free black man named Samuel Wright, made contact with Elijah Anderson in Madison, Indiana. What happened during their meetings would remain disputed for years, with each man telling a different version of events. But the consequences of their encounter would change everything, not just for Anderson, but for the hundreds of people whose freedom depended on his network. The meeting between Webb and Anderson took place in a small church on Madison's west side, a congregation of free black residents where Anderson sometimes attended services. Webb had spent weeks establishing his cover identity, renting a room in a boarding house, taking odd jobs, and carefully letting it be known through trusted intermediaries that he was seeking help to rescue his wife from slavery. Anderson was cautious. He didn't approach Webb directly, but sent intermediaries to ask questions, to probe for inconsistencies in his story, to test whether he might be an informant. Webb had prepared well, creating a detailed backstory complete with names, dates, and locations that could be verified. He claimed his wife, Martha, had been sold to a plantation near Versailles, Kentucky, after their owner's death had forced the estate's liquidation. He said he'd been working for 2 years to save the money needed to purchase her freedom, but the new owner refused to sell. He'd heard through friends in Cincinnati that there was a man in Madison who might be able to help. After 3 weeks of careful vetting, Anderson finally agreed to meet with Webb personally. They sat in the church's small back room on a cold March evening, with only a single candle providing light. Anderson's first words were a warning. "If you're not who you say you are," Anderson said quietly. "If you're working for slave catchers or the association, you should know that I've been threatened before. I've had men try to trap me, to follow me, to gather evidence against me. They've all failed. I'm still here, and the people I've helped are free in Canada. So if this is a game, you should leave now." Webb, maintaining his character, responded with the desperation of a man separated from his wife. He provided details about Martha, about their life together, about his determination to free her regardless of the cost. He offered to pay Anderson $300, a substantial sum that suggested both genuine need and significant resources. Anderson listened without expression, then asked a question that revealed the depth of his operations' sophistication. "How do I know your wife wants to be rescued?" The question caught Webb off guard. In all his preparation, he hadn't considered that Anderson would care about the wishes of the enslaved person. Most abolitionists assumed all enslaved people wanted freedom, but Anderson was asking something more nuanced. Did this specific woman want to risk her life in an escape attempt? Did she know her husband was trying to rescue her? Had she agreed to the plan? Webb improvised, claiming he'd managed to send a message through a traveling preacher, that Martha knew he was working to free her, that she was waiting for an opportunity. Anderson seemed satisfied with this answer, but he imposed a condition. Before he would agree to help, he needed to verify that Martha existed, that she was where Webb claimed, and that she genuinely wanted to escape. "I don't move people who don't want to be moved," Anderson explained. "I don't separate families unless they choose separation, and I don't risk my network on situations I haven't personally verified. If your wife is real and wants freedom, I'll help you. But first I need to confirm your story." This presented Webb with a dilemma. He'd invented Martha entirely. There was no enslaved woman waiting to be rescued. If Anderson investigated and found no one matching Webb's description, his cover would be blown. But if Webb backed out now, he'd lose his chance to gather evidence. Webb made a decision that would haunt him later. He told Anderson that time was critical, that Martha's owner was planning to sell her to a trader heading to New Orleans, that they had perhaps 2 weeks before she'd be moved beyond reach. He offered to pay Anderson an additional $100 if he could execute the rescue quickly without the usual verification process. Anderson refused. "I don't work that way," he said. "I've built this network by being careful, by never taking unnecessary risks, by verifying every detail. If your wife is about to be sold, then we need to move quickly, but we still need to move carefully. Give me 1 week. I'll send someone to verify your story. If everything checks out, I'll have your wife in Madison within 2 weeks after that." Webb had no choice but to agree. He paid Anderson a $50 deposit and waited to see what would happen next. What he didn't know was that Anderson had already suspected something was wrong with Webb's story. Small inconsistencies in his account, subtle tells in his body language, questions that seemed designed to elicit specific information. Anderson had seen it all before. He'd agreed to help not because he believed Webb, but because he wanted to know who had sent him. 3 days after their meeting, Anderson sent a message to Webb. His contact in Kentucky had found Martha. She was indeed planning to be sold, and she was eager to escape. Anderson requested the remaining $250 and said he'd have Martha in Madison within 10 days. Webb was confused. He'd invented Martha. She didn't exist, yet Anderson claimed to have found her. Either Anderson was lying to extract payment, or something else was happening that Webb didn't understand. He decided to pay the money and see what Anderson would deliver. What arrived in Madison 10 days later wasn't a woman named Martha. It was a young man named Thomas, escaped from a plantation near Versailles, carrying a message for Webb. The message, written in careful script on a small piece of paper, contained just 3 sentences. I know who you are. I know who sent you. If you want to understand what you're really fighting against, meet me at the place where you first lied to me. Webb realized he'd been outmaneuvered. Anderson had never believed his story, had never intended to rescue a fictional wife, but had used Webb's own deception to accomplish something else entirely. The escape of a real person who genuinely needed help. And now Anderson was offering Webb something unexpected, a chance to see the truth of what he'd been hired to destroy. Against his better judgment, against his professional training, against the explicit instructions of his employers, Marcus Webb went to meet Elijah Anderson at the church where they'd first spoken. What Anderson told him during that meeting would never be fully recorded, but its impact on Webb was profound and lasting. Years later, in a private letter discovered after his death, Webb would write, I went to that church intending to gather final evidence for Anderson's arrest. I left questioning everything I'd been hired to do. He didn't try to convert me to abolitionism or appeal to my morality. Instead, he showed me documents, letters from people he'd helped, testimonies from families reunited, records of children who'd been saved from being sold away from their parents. And then he asked me a question I couldn't answer. How much would you pay to keep your family together? How far would you go to protect your children from being sold like livestock? I had no answer, because I'd never had to face such choices. My family was free, safe, protected by law. His question made me realize that I was working to preserve a system that made such questions necessary. Webb didn't immediately abandon his investigation, but something had changed. He submitted a report to the Kentucky Association that documented Anderson's methods, but recommended against prosecution, arguing that the evidence was insufficient and that attempting to arrest Anderson might create a public controversy that would draw unwanted attention to the association's activities. The association rejected his recommendation and hired a new investigator to continue the work. But Webb had done something else during his time infiltrating Anderson's network, something he never reported to his employers. He documented the names and locations of Anderson's safe houses, the identities of his contacts, the routes he used, and the methods of his communication system. And instead of turning this information over to the association, Webb had hidden it, creating a detailed map of the entire network that he kept in a sealed envelope with instructions that it should be destroyed unopened if anything happened to him. That envelope would resurface years later, under circumstances no one could have predicted, and its contents would finally reveal the full scope of what Elijah Anderson had built, and the terrible price he would pay for building it. By 1845, Elijah Anderson's network had grown beyond anything he'd originally envisioned. What had started as occasional help for desperate fugitives had evolved into a systematic operation that moved an estimated 100 to 150 people per year from slavery to freedom. Anderson had expanded his network of safe houses, recruited new conductors, and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for evading capture. But success brought danger. As more enslaved people disappeared from Kentucky plantations, as financial losses mounted for slave owners, as Anderson's reputation spread throughout both enslaved and free black communities, the pressure to stop him intensified. The reward for his capture had grown to $1,500, enough money to tempt even those who might otherwise sympathize with his cause. Anderson knew he was being hunted. He'd survived multiple attempts to capture him, including an incident in 1843 when slave catchers had crossed into Indiana and tried to kidnap him from his home. Only the intervention of Madison's free black community, who'd surrounded his house armed with clubs and farming tools, had prevented his capture. The incident had created a diplomatic crisis between Indiana and Kentucky, with Kentucky's governor demanding that Indiana authorities arrest Anderson for inciting violence, and Indiana's governor refusing on the grounds that Anderson had been the victim of an illegal kidnapping attempt. The incident had also revealed something important. Anderson had allies in Madison who were willing to risk their own safety to protect him. The free black community understood that if Anderson could be kidnapped with impunity, none of them were safe. White abolitionists, including several prominent Quaker families, had also begun providing financial support and legal assistance. Anderson was no longer operating alone. He'd become the center of a broader resistance movement, but this visibility came with costs. Anderson's wife, Sarah, had grown increasingly fearful for their safety. They'd received threatening letters, found their property vandalized, and endured constant surveillance from suspicious neighbors and visiting Kentuckians. In 1844, Sarah had given birth to their first child, a daughter they named Mary, and the responsibility of protecting his family weighed heavily on Anderson. In the spring of 1846, Anderson made a decision that would prove fateful. He decided to expand his operations directly into Kentucky, establishing safe houses south of the Ohio River, where fugitives could hide before making the dangerous river crossing. This was an enormous risk. If caught in Kentucky, Anderson would be subject to that state's laws, which imposed severe penalties for helping enslaved people escape. Anderson recruited a network of contacts in Kentucky. Free black people, sympathetic poor whites, and even a few enslaved people who were willing to risk punishment to help others. He began making regular trips across the river, sometimes disguised as a traveling merchant, sometimes as a laborer seeking work, sometimes simply moving at night through forests and back roads that he'd memorized. It was during one of these trips in July 1846 that Anderson encountered a situation that would test everything he'd built. He'd been contacted by a free black minister in Lexington named Reverend James Harper, who'd received a desperate plea from a woman named Elizabeth. Elizabeth was enslaved on a large plantation near Frankfort, and her owner had recently died. The estate was being liquidated, and Elizabeth, along with her 3 children, was scheduled to be sold at auction in 2 weeks. Elizabeth's husband had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi 3 years earlier. She would never see him again. But she was determined that her children wouldn't suffer the same fate. She wanted Anderson to help them escape before the auction. The situation was complicated by several factors. The plantation was heavily guarded, aware that enslaved people might try to escape before the sale. Elizabeth's children were young, ages 5, 7, and 9, which would make traveling difficult, and the auction was being heavily advertised, which meant slave traders from across the South would be in Frankfort, making the town dangerous for any black person without ironclad documentation. Anderson spent 3 days surveying the plantation, studying the guards' routines, identifying possible escape routes, and making contact with Elizabeth through intermediaries. What he discovered was that a successful escape would require something he'd never attempted before: removing 4 people simultaneously from a guarded plantation, moving them through hostile territory with children in tow, and doing it all within a narrow window of time before the auction. The plan Anderson devised was audacious. On the night before the auction, when guards would be most relaxed, assuming no one would try to escape so close to the sale, Anderson would create a diversion on one side of the plantation, while Elizabeth and her children slipped away from the other side. They'd travel to a safe house 5 miles away, hide there during the day, then move at night through a series of stations until they reached the Ohio River. Anderson had arranged for a boat to be waiting at a specific location, manned by a German immigrant who asked no questions and accepted payment in advance. The escape was set for the night of August 12, 1846. Anderson crossed into Kentucky 3 days earlier, moving between safe houses and finalizing arrangements. Everything was in place. The diversion was planned, the route was clear, the boat was ready. But on August 11th, something went wrong. One of Anderson's contacts in Frankfort, a free black man who worked as a stable hand, was arrested on suspicion of helping slaves escape. Under interrogation, which in Kentucky meant brutal physical coercion, the man revealed that something was planned for the plantation near Frankfort, though he didn't know the details. Authorities immediately increased security at all plantations in the area where auctions were scheduled. Anderson learned about the arrest through his network, but by then it was too late to call off the escape. Elizabeth and her children were expecting him. They'd already made their own preparations, saying goodbyes to people they'd never see again, gathering what few possessions they could carry. If Anderson didn't come, they'd be sold at auction the next day, scattered to different buyers, their family destroyed forever. Anderson made a choice that revealed the depth of his commitment. He decided to proceed with the escape despite the increased danger, but he would modify the plan to account for the heightened security. Instead of creating a diversion, which might now be expected, he would rely on stealth and timing. And instead of using the planned route, which might be watched, he would take Elizabeth and her children through a more dangerous path, directly through Frankfort itself, hiding in plain sight among the crowds gathered for the auction. On the night of August 12, Elijah Anderson entered the plantation near Frankfort. What happened during the next 12 hours would become the subject of legend, testimony, and dispute. Multiple versions of the story would emerge, each differing in details but agreeing on the essential facts. Anderson successfully removed Elizabeth and her 3 children from the plantation, moved them through Frankfort during the chaos of auction day, and transported them across the Ohio River to freedom. But the escape came at a cost. During the journey through Frankfort, Anderson was spotted by a slave trader who recognized him from wanted posters. The trader alerted authorities, and a pursuit began. Anderson managed to evade capture long enough to get Elizabeth and her children to the river and onto the waiting boat. But in doing so, he revealed his face, his methods, and his presence in Kentucky to dozens of witnesses. For the first time in his career, Elijah Anderson had been positively identified operating in Kentucky. Warrants were issued for his arrest. His description was circulated throughout the state. And the Kentucky Association for the Protection of Property Rights, which had been trying to capture him for years, finally had the evidence they needed to pursue him across state lines. Anderson made it back to Madison, but he knew his situation had changed fundamentally. He could no longer operate with the relative anonymity that had protected him. His face was known, his methods were understood, and powerful forces were determined to stop him. Some of his allies urged him to flee to Canada, to abandon his network and save himself. But Anderson refused. "If I run," he told a gathering of supporters in Madison, "the network collapses. Hundreds of people are depending on the routes we've established, the contacts we've made, the safe houses we've built. If I disappear, all of that disappears with me. I didn't start this work to save myself. I started it to save others. And that work isn't finished. What Anderson didn't know was that his enemies had already set in motion a plan that would finally bring him down. A plan that exploited the one vulnerability he'd never fully protected against. Betrayal from within his own network. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. In October 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law that required citizens of free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves and imposed severe penalties on anyone who helped fugitives. The law transformed the landscape of the Underground Railroad, making previously safe territories dangerous and forcing conductors like Anderson to develop new methods. But the law also created opportunities for those willing to profit from betrayal. Rewards for captured fugitives increased, and the legal risks of helping escapees became severe enough that some people who'd previously supported the Underground Railroad withdrew their assistance. One of Anderson's contacts in southern Indiana, a farmer named William Groves who'd operated a safe house for 3 years, found himself in financial trouble in early 1851. His crops had failed, he owed money to creditors, and he was facing the loss of his farm. When a Kentucky slave catcher named Thomas Stevens approached Groves with an offer, $500 in exchange for information about Anderson's network, Groves struggled with his conscience for several weeks before finally agreeing. Groves didn't provide information directly about Anderson, which might have been too obvious. Instead, he revealed the locations of several safe houses in Indiana and the names of other conductors in the network. Stevens used this information to set up surveillance, watching the safe houses and tracking the movements of fugitives and conductors. Over several months, Stevens built a detailed picture of how Anderson's network operated. In August 1851, Stevens learned that Anderson was planning a major operation, the rescue of 17 enslaved people from a plantation in Bourbon County, Kentucky. The group included entire families who'd been threatened with sale and separation. It was the largest single rescue Anderson had ever attempted, requiring coordination among multiple conductors, several safe houses, and careful timing. Stevens saw an opportunity. If he could catch Anderson in Kentucky with 17 fugitive slaves, the evidence would be overwhelming. Anderson could be prosecuted under Kentucky law, convicted, and imprisoned, effectively ending his network's operations. Stevens coordinated with Kentucky authorities and slave catchers, setting up a trap. The rescue was planned for the night of September 20th, 1851. Anderson crossed into Kentucky with 2 other conductors, intending to move the 17 people in 3 groups along different routes to minimize risk. But Stevens had positioned men along all the likely routes, waiting for Anderson to reveal himself. The trap was sprung near the town of Paris, Kentucky, as Anderson's group was moving through a wooded area toward a safe house. Stevens and 6 other men, including local law enforcement, surrounded the group. Anderson tried to flee, but he was captured after a brief chase. The 17 fugitives were also captured and returned to their owners. Anderson was taken to the Bourbon County Jail in Paris, where he was charged with multiple counts of slave stealing, conspiracy, and violation of Kentucky law. The charges carried potential sentences totaling over 40 years in prison. His trial was scheduled for November 1851. News of Anderson's capture spread quickly through abolitionist networks. Supporters in Indiana and Ohio raised money for his legal defense. Newspapers in the North published articles about his case, portraying him as a hero fighting against an unjust system. But in Kentucky, public opinion was firmly against him. He was seen as a criminal who'd stolen valuable property and encouraged slave rebellion. Anderson's trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: testimony from slave owners whose property had disappeared, testimony from the 17 captured fugitives who confirmed Anderson had helped them, testimony from William Groves about the network's operations, and testimony from Thomas Stevens about Anderson's activities in Kentucky. Anderson's defense attorney, a young lawyer from Cincinnati named Robert Hayes, who'd volunteered to take the case, argued that Anderson had acted from moral conviction, that the laws he'd violated were themselves unjust, and that helping people escape from slavery was not a crime, but a humanitarian act. The jury, composed entirely of white Kentucky men, many of them slave owners, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. At his sentencing hearing on November 18, 1851, Anderson was given an opportunity to speak. What he said would be recorded by a court stenographer and later published in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North. "I stand before you convicted of crimes against the laws of Kentucky," Anderson said, "but I am guilty of no crime against the laws of God or the principles of humanity. I have helped men, women, and children escape from bondage. I have reunited families torn apart by sale. I have given hope to people who had no hope. If these actions are crimes in Kentucky, then I am proud to be a criminal. But I believe that history will judge me more kindly than this court has done. I believe that future generations will look back on this trial and ask not why I did what I did, but why anyone thought it was wrong." The judge, unmoved by Anderson's speech, sentenced him to 20 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Frankfort. Anderson was 41 years old. If he served his full sentence, he would be 61 when released, if he survived at all. Anderson was transferred to the penitentiary in December 1851. The prison was a brutal place, where inmates worked long hours in harsh conditions, where disease was common, and where discipline was enforced through physical punishment. Anderson was assigned to work in the prison's hemp factory, where inmates processed raw hemp into rope and cloth, breathing toxic dust and working with dangerous machinery. For the first few years of his imprisonment, Anderson maintained hope. He received letters from supporters, learned that his wife Sarah and daughter Mary were safe in Madison, and heard that his network, though damaged by his capture, was still operating under new leadership. But as years passed, as his health deteriorated from the harsh prison conditions, as the possibility of pardon or early release faded, Anderson's hope began to dim. In 1856, Anderson developed a persistent cough that prison doctors diagnosed as consumption, tuberculosis. The disease was common in the prison's overcrowded, poorly ventilated conditions, and treatment was minimal. Anderson's health declined rapidly over the following months. By the summer of 1857, he was too weak to work and was confined to the prison's hospital ward. It was during these final months that something strange began to happen, something that would fuel speculation and mystery for generations. Anderson began receiving visits from people who shouldn't have had access to him. Free black people from Frankfort, white abolitionists from the North, and even, according to some accounts, formerly enslaved people he'd helped escape years earlier. How these visitors gained access to a maximum security prisoner was never explained. Prison records from this period are incomplete, with several pages missing from the visitor logs. What these visitors discussed with Anderson was never recorded, but guards who witnessed the meetings reported that Anderson seemed to be giving instructions, sharing information, and coordinating activities even from his deathbed. One guard later testified that he'd seen Anderson hand a small package to a visitor, though he couldn't say what the package contained. On the morning of October 30th, 1857, Elijah Anderson died in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. He was 47 years old. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, which was certainly true, but 3 guards who'd been on duty that night later reported strange circumstances surrounding his death. According to their accounts, Anderson had been unconscious for most of the previous day, barely breathing, clearly near death. But around midnight, he'd suddenly awakened, alert and lucid. He'd asked for water, drunk it slowly, and then spoken to the guards in a clear, strong voice that seemed impossible for a dying man. One guard reported that Anderson had said, "Tell them the map is complete. Tell them the routes are marked. Tell them the work continues." The guards had no idea what Anderson meant, but they were disturbed by his sudden lucidity and the intensity of his gaze. Then, just as suddenly, Anderson had closed his eyes and stopped breathing. He died without struggle, without pain, as if he'd simply decided it was time. The prison warden, a man named Charles Whitfield, ordered Anderson's body buried immediately, within 6 hours of his death. No autopsy was performed, no family was notified, and no public announcement was made. Anderson was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, and the location of that grave was never recorded in official documents. Why the rush to bury Anderson? Why the secrecy? Warden Whitfield never explained his decision, but years later, a letter he'd written to the Kentucky Association for the Protection of Property Rights was discovered in private archives. The letter, dated November 1st, 1857, contained a single paragraph. "The prisoner Anderson is dead and buried. I have followed your instructions regarding disposal of the body and destruction of certain materials found in his cell. The matter is concluded." What materials were found in Anderson's cell? What instructions had the association given? And why did they want Anderson's burial kept secret? These questions would remain unanswered for decades, until the discovery of Marcus Webb's sealed envelope finally revealed the truth. The envelope surfaced in 1889, 32 years after Anderson's death, when Marcus Webb's estate was being settled after his death in Chicago. Webb had become a successful businessman after leaving his work as an investigator, and his personal papers included the sealed envelope he'd created in 1841 with instructions that it should be opened only after his death. Webb's executor, following the instructions, opened the envelope and found 2 documents inside. The first was the detailed map of Anderson's network that Webb had created during his infiltration, a document that showed safe houses, routes, contacts, and methods spanning from Kentucky to Canada. The second was a letter Webb had written explaining why he'd hidden the map rather than turning it over to his employers. In the letter, Webb described his meeting with Anderson in 1841, the questions Anderson had asked him, and the realization that had changed his perspective. But the letter also contained information Webb had discovered years later, information that explained the mystery of Anderson's final days and the secrecy surrounding his burial. According to Webb's letter, Anderson had spent his years in prison doing something remarkable. He'd been documenting his entire network, creating a comprehensive guide that would allow others to continue his work. Using smuggled paper and ink, working in secret during his rare moments of privacy, Anderson had drawn maps, written instructions, and recorded the names and locations of every contact in his network. He'd created a manual for the Underground Railroad, a document that contained everything he'd learned during 15 years of operations. Anderson had known he was dying. He'd known he wouldn't leave prison alive, but he'd been determined that his network wouldn't die with him. The visitors who'd come to see him in his final months had been couriers, collecting pieces of the manual, smuggling them out of the prison, and distributing them to conductors throughout the North. The package Anderson had handed to a visitor, which the guard had witnessed but couldn't identify, had been the final section of the manual, the most sensitive information, including the locations of safe houses in Kentucky that were still operational. When Anderson died, prison authorities had searched his cell and found evidence of his documentation project. Hidden papers, crude maps drawn on scraps of cloth, notes written in code. Warden Whitfield, under pressure from the Kentucky Association, had ordered everything destroyed, and Anderson buried quickly to prevent his grave from becoming a rallying point for abolitionists. But the association had been too late. Anderson's manual was already in circulation, being used by conductors throughout the Underground Railroad network. The information he'd preserved during his imprisonment would help hundreds more people escape from slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War. Webb's letter concluded with a reflection on Anderson's legacy. I was hired to destroy Elijah Anderson's network. Instead, I witnessed the creation of something that couldn't be destroyed. An idea, a method, a proof that organized resistance could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Anderson died in prison, but his work survived him. And in surviving, it helped bring about the end of the very institution he'd fought against. The discovery of Webb's envelope in 1889 sparked renewed interest in Anderson's story. Historians began researching his life, interviewing people who'd known him, and tracking down the formerly enslaved people he'd helped. What emerged was a picture of a man whose impact had been far greater than anyone had realized. Estimates of the number of people Anderson helped escape vary, but most historians agree it was between 1,000 and 1,500 individuals, an extraordinary number for a single conductor. His network had operated for approximately 16 years, from around 1835 to 1851, and had maintained a success rate that remained unmatched by any other Underground Railroad operation. But perhaps Anderson's greatest legacy wasn't the number of people he saved. It was the system he created. His methods of communication, his network structure, his use of forged documents, and his careful verification procedures became models for other conductors. The manual he'd created in prison was copied and distributed, influencing Underground Railroad operations throughout the North. After the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, many of the people Anderson had helped came forward to share their stories. They described his careful planning, his personal courage, and his unwavering commitment to their freedom. They told of how he'd risked his life repeatedly, how he'd used his own money when necessary, and how he'd treated every person he helped with dignity and respect. Anderson's wife, Sarah, lived until 1892, long enough to see her husband's story finally told. In an interview conducted when she was 78 years old, she was asked what she wanted people to remember about Elijah. Her answer was simple. He believed that every person deserved to be free, and he was willing to sacrifice everything to make that belief real. He didn't do it for glory or recognition. He did it because it was right. And he never stopped, even when it cost him his freedom and eventually his life. The location of Anderson's grave remains unknown, The prison cemetery where he was buried was later relocated, and records of the grave locations were lost. But in 1920, the city of Madison, Indiana, erected a small monument in the cemetery where Anderson's wife and daughter are buried. The monument bears a simple inscription, Elijah Anderson, 1810-1857, the Moses of Kentucky. He led his people to freedom. Today, historians continue to uncover new information about Anderson's network and methods. Documents surface occasionally in archives, letters are discovered in old houses, and descendants of people Anderson helped share family stories passed down through generations. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how one man, born into slavery, managed to create a system that challenged the entire institution of slavery. But some mysteries remain. How did Anderson first learn the skills needed to run such a sophisticated operation? Where did he get his initial funding? How did he make contact with enslaved people deep in Kentucky's interior? And what happened to the complete version of the manual he created in prison? The document that contained all his methods and knowledge? These questions may never be fully answered. But perhaps that's appropriate for a man who spent his life operating in shadows, keeping secrets, and protecting the people who depended on him. Elijah Anderson's greatest skill wasn't just helping people escape, it was knowing what information to reveal and what to keep hidden. Understanding that some secrets needed to be protected even after death. What we do know is that Elijah Anderson existed, that he helped hundreds of people escape from slavery, that he built a network that operated with remarkable effectiveness, and that he died in prison still trying to continue his work. These facts alone make his story worth remembering, not as a legend or myth, but as a historical reality that demonstrates what one person, armed with courage and conviction, can accomplish against overwhelming odds. The true story of the Moses of Kentucky isn't just about escapes and rescues, it's about the power of organized resistance, the importance of systematic thinking in the face of injustice, and the reality that change often comes not from grand gestures, but from the patient, dangerous, daily work of people willing to risk everything for what they believe is right. Elijah Anderson was such a person. And though he died in an unmarked grave, though his story was suppressed for generations, though powerful forces tried to erase his legacy, he succeeded in the only way that truly matters. The people he saved lived free, raised families in freedom, and passed down stories of the man who'd made their freedom possible. In the end, that's the only monument that matters. Not stone or bronze, but living memory, carried forward by those whose lives were changed by one man's refusal to accept that some people were meant to be enslaved.